Welcome back, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here today with Meg Lemke, founder. You're the founder, right? Co-founder?
I started when it was founded, but I'm
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Editor of Mutha magazine, and also dweller in my hometown. So we were just chatting about the old neighborhood and chatting about our hair, among other things. So how is the neighborhood these days?
I mean, it's been good lately. It was definitely difficult being in New York over the last 2 years, but right now it's doing great. I like my neighborhood a lot.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you for coming out today. Thanks for joining us. And anyone in attendance, any questions you have, just go ahead and type them into the chat and I'll work them into the conversation. So let's jump right in. If you can tell us the origin story of the magazine. It sounded like other people founded it, but you came on board at some point. Tell us how that happened.
Oh, sure. Okay, so Mutha magazine was founded in 2013, and the founder was Michelle T, who a lot of folks tuning in probably know. Sure. She's a really seminal poet and memoirist and fiction writer, and really just incredible icon, of queer literature, particularly in the 90s, which is when I started reading her. And I had known Michelle for years. I worked in different roles in publishing, but I came out of book publishing before I started working on the magazine. And I knew Michelle was trying to get pregnant. She started a series at Exo Jane, Getting Pregnant with Michelle T, and it was about her experience in a queer couple creating family. And she got into, as she has always, the details with aplomb, just with a raw honesty about both the medical and emotional details of her journey to getting pregnant. And I was a fan for years, and I had talked to her at various points about working on books together. We had just known each other a long time. And I ran into her at Book Expo, when my daughter was 2. I have 2 kids. And she told me she was going to start this magazine. She hadn't gotten pregnant yet, but she wanted to create a space for different stories about parenting and motherhood. She wanted to create something that did not exist. It had existed in some ways with Hip Mama, which is a fantastic magazine, but she wanted to create something totally new. And Hip Mama, I think, would be our strongest. I think we actually ran an interview very early on with Ariel Gore to say, it's the mother of Mutha. It was our strongest model. And she asked me to work with her on it. And I did. From early on. I started editing actually the comics section. So a lot of my other work is in comics and graphic novels. So I'm the editor-in-chief of Mutha magazine. I also am the comics and graphic novel reviews editor at Publishers Weekly. So I have this bridge between literature. I've done a lot of prose editing and edited prose books, and then comics and graphic novels. So I'm telling you sort of my personal story coming to the magazine, but the magazine's founding was really about this moment in parenting, motherhood, and literature where a lot of things were very cookie cutter. And, the landscape has changed significantly over the almost 10 years that Mutha has existed. But Michelle launched the magazine, and it had this fabulous launch because she has a huge audience and fan base, and people love her and love her voice. And she got pregnant in that year, and I think that I thought at the time, really, I have a maternal instinct. I felt almost very nervous about her undertaking this project. I knew she knew what she was doing, but I thought, what if it doesn't work out? What if she doesn't? And she just knew she would, not necessarily get pregnant, which is what happened, but that she would create a family, and that she was creating the space for that to find its community, her voice and her kinds of work and the kinds of people that she published. And I love that about her. She's a really inspirational and magical person. She also is literally believes in magic and does a lot of work around magic. Oh, wow. I think, I brought to this work an editorial tradition that's in some ways more regimented, and Michelle brought all of this light and spirit and inspiration. And when she had her baby, a lot of parents who are writers will know that's a hard reckoning of how much you can do and undertake. And she realized there were other projects, that she was writing another book, and she just gifted me the magazine to continue. So she launched it, and within the first year or so, I took it over, and I've been running it ever since. So I've run it since 2014.
Okay.
And now we're an editorial collective. So actually I ran it really as a solo operation until my second child was born. And then similarly, I was either the magazine does not continue or some of our contributing writers helped me out, and people stepped up and did. And that's when Cheryl Klein in particular, as well as Jennifer Bryant and Ezra came on. So I can list the full masthead actually in a bit, but we have other editors and other contributing editors who at different times have participated, and it's Ezra Stone, I should say, and Ezra does poetry. Cheryl really covers adoption and fosterhood, but she covers many other areas as well. And then Jennifer in particular was herself a teen mom, and now has a teenager herself, and she covers a lot to do with teen parenting and young parenting. But those specializations don't define all the work that they bring to the magazine. Okay. And then we have contributing writers, contributing editors. So we became more of a collective in a similar way when I think the magazine in general has followed the editorial group's own parenting. Like as our experiences have changed, the magazine has come together as a community to continue running.
That's great. So you mentioned you were at Book Expo and you have a background. You work for Publishers Weekly still
yes,
now.
It's my job now.
And how did all of the editors find each other? Because I know that's a question people have. People watching this might want to get involved in similar magazines or create magazines like this. How did you all meet each other and find each other and connect and know that you would work well together?
Right. So with Michelle, she and I had just known each other over the years. I mean, quite literally, she was an author I wanted to publish. And I wasn't able to acquire a book of hers when I was at Houghton Mifflin. Honestly, I think they were just too buttoned up still at the time, which has somewhat changed. Well, now they don't exist in the same form in any case. So I just kept in touch with her. I mean, really the answer is like what can be very frustrating for some people about publishing, particularly New York-based publishing, that Michelle was in California, is that people do know each other. Like networking is a real thing. Like you get to know people over time. You go to literary events, you volunteer. I volunteered for 13 years at the Brooklyn Book Festival on the Literary Council doing programming. So every other week, I was spending the morning, around a table with Rob Spillman, who's at Tin House, and Lisa Lucas, who ended up now as publisher of Pantheon. So you basically do professional service where you volunteer your time and you get to know people, and you go out there and you attend events, you strike up correspondences, you make friends, but through the natural course of your work, you accumulate relationships. So like this was a relationship I'd had over the years with Michelle, and sort of tried to find ways that I could work with her. It was really me wanting to publish her. And then it ended up being that she invited me to join her as an editor at a magazine she was starting, and then gave this gift of it. And then the editors we work with now really came out of being authors. They were authors who we published multiple times. And I often, if I'm publishing an author repeatedly in the magazine, and for example, a book comes in where I think that we could either review it or do an interview, I'll offer that opportunity to write. We published, and then you start to see how they are on it in a different type of task, not necessarily personal essay, but editing down an interview. And you start to see like what that relationship is like. And then you reach out. I mean, that's what really happened is I said, who do I trust and who do I know and who have I worked with? And then that's how it builds.
Makes sense. So you mentioned there was like sort of cookie cutter writing at the beginning, like when the magazine first started.
The magazine started without that. I mean, I think we were in response to there not being a sense of really an alternative space to talk about motherhood. I think, and I don't want to erase all the unusual alternative spaces that already existed. Like I mentioned, Ariel Gore's Hit Mama magazine was a huge inspiration, something I had read through college. And as I was thinking about becoming a parent, and when I first started in the publishing industry, I was at a literary agency in Seattle. And we briefly represented Anne Halliday, who wrote The Big Rumpus, who has a zine. So like the zine world, and Anne's part particularly with really across the course of her kids' lives, writing about being a parent. There were lots of models and spaces, but really in like the web space, there was a lot of like what to expect when you're expecting. And it felt very white bread, and very prescriptive. So I think what we wanted in some ways was to create a space where if you Googled, like, I'm having trouble nursing, you didn't just come back with instructions and more shame upon shame. You came back with personal stories and more of a sense of what people really found useful in their day-to-day lives, which was connecting with other parents who were struggling or who had like light to offer about experience and a sense of humor and said things that people were unsure about saying out loud. Let me get this beeping off of my, go away beeping thing. hopefully that will do it.
Yeah. So can you tell us the different section? Because you guys publish a lot. So I saw there's comics, 99 story, there are all these different sections. How should a writer navigate the site? How should a reader navigate the site? Let's just start. What are the different sections that are on the site?
I had to pull up my magazine to tell you. So the sections the categorization is more like based on discovery and a sense of whimsy, right? So the categorizations are in some ways a joke too. Like, how do you categorize any story about parenting?
Right.
So we publish broad spectrum of work. We publish birth stories, we publish a lot around loss. So something that happened quite early on is, as we started publishing birth stories, we started receiving stories about loss, and the honor of publishing stories around people who had lost children, who had lost pregnancies, who had lost family members around the time of their pregnancies, and realizing how important that category became. So really, birth and loss are the twin sections of the magazine, and birth also being family origin stories, which are quite varied. So adoption, fosterhood, found family, later forming a family that is necessarily with infants, and looking a lot also there about IVF, purposeful construction of families and queer family. We mostly publish women and non-binary folks. We also publish selectively men, and particularly trans men. And we publish a number of trans men who have gone through the pregnancy experience or have created family in various ways. And things like the comics section really arose because I love comics and comics narratives. And so that became actually a very strong part of Mutha magazine. And I would say while Best American Comics was running, regularly ended up in their honorables list. And we had one piece we published early on was an Eisner nominee for best short story in comics. So that was a section that really grew very quickly because there wasn't, that again tracks the comics industry in general. Folks who know indie comics in the last 10 years has been a huge influx of women and people of color and queer folks into indie comics. And so a lot of those women were thinking about getting pregnant, and people of other genders were thinking about getting pregnant. So we were a space where they could speak to those stories that was welcoming. And so we became a home for that. And that was something I was really proud of. But in terms of how, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, is the comics section open to fictionalized narrative? Because it seems like a lot of the writing is personal, but if somebody
almost everything is nonfiction on the site.
Right. Okay.
So to give you that very basic, we publish nonfiction and poetry. So the comics is the one place where we've more often made moves into autofiction or pieces that are not gag comics, but are like, they're not true. They're true in a way. Like we have a very funny series by Rachel Deutsch where she has these sort of characters going through the day and like they're trying to nurse, but they're like, I'm nursing broken glass, and like they're literally showing that. So it's a fantastical medium in a lot of ways. So you'll see more fantastical stories that are getting at a greater truth. We don't generally publish straight fiction. There's maybe an exception or two. I don't think so, and I don't want to say that out loud. So more people submit me fiction. So generally, if you're going to do a story from other magazines, a personal essay or a reported piece or a poem, and that we also publish more rarely, but we've done more recently.
And so you mentioned reading stories about loss, and I'm wondering, like, how do you as an editor handle reading? I imagine a lot of the material you get can be really harrowing and difficult, and how do you kind of stomach the work? On some level, I like what you were saying, that it's such an honor to read, especially if it's personal experience. People are sharing these really deep experiences with you. But as an editor, I imagine also, like, God, I can't read more than 3 of these a day. So how do you kind of like keep your wits about you as you're going through these submissions?
I mean, I think a joke about me, I see my friend Kate, who's also a Mutha writer, is here in the chat. Hi, Kate. And so Kate would get this about me. People will say all the time, like, I hope that's not TMI. And my response is, I'm here for all the eye. I want all the eye. Like, I want everything. I really am someone who is interested in getting all of the details, and I have a a high tolerance, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
for difficult stories. That being said, it is hard, you know, and it's particularly hard because I've had the experience of publishing the work of people I know personally. You know, as we said, over time, you develop a network. And so if those writers bring you their stories, you know, you're grateful to have them. And then it can be quite difficult because you know them, or you might have known their child or their family.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to your point, how I handle it is essentially like taking it as the honor and privilege that it is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think even if we end up not publishing a piece, it's a birth story or a loss story for various reasons, you know, whether the writing just isn't a fit for us, or maybe we've published something that is too similar in some way, I still really consider it a privilege and an honor and try and treat it in that fashion. And I do edit birth stories and edit loss stories. Like we edit them as we would any other essay, but I would say that the process is much more careful, you know, in that I'm thinking about the psychology around it and really deferential. I think I have a deferential process that I try to. I mean, I try and treat all of our authors with a lot of deference, but, you know, I wouldn't push obviously in the same ways, or I would allow a lot more. We are a space for kind of more raw writing. I would go longer, for example, like we're not as strict on word count, because this is someone's first story or someone's story of a loss. It doesn't have to fit 1,500 words. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, sure.
And sharing it with my colleagues is a big part of it, you know, and knowing what they're going through. Cheryl Klein, for example, is writing about her experience right now, trying to adopt a second child, and she's gone through a lot. And I'm editing her work actually as we go, and knowing where she is right now will affect what I send her or don't send her. And I know she has a very high tolerance also for, and that isn't even the right way of phrasing it, like a desire to have these real stories told, like it's something that we're seeking out. But yeah, I'll still think about, you know, the essays that she just published. Like, did she just have a hard experience where an adoption didn't go through? You know, I might wait a couple weeks, you know, and I think I am the one getting all the inbox, so that can be difficult. And then part of that is I'll step away from the inbox if I'm not in a space to receive these stories and I'm not reading them every day. And that is something that about the magazine is also a privilege, because we are a collective, we're unfunded, we're just a passion project. I have a day job. Everyone who works in the magazine has a day job. We're not the fastest, but we are doing it for the love of the work and for creating community. And so we don't have a need to publish every week or every day. We do it based on the needs of the work.
Okay, so there's not a strict publishing schedule.
We try to publish every week, but we don't always.
Okay. So take us through your editorial process. It sounds like the work comes to you in the inbox and then you delegate it to other
exactly
editors?
Or I solicit work, but mostly it comes to us.
Okay. And every editor reads the work, or do you have
I read the work, and then if I think that a topic is something another editor would want to read, or I just have too much coming in, I'll forward it to the other editors and they'll take it from there. So they might reject it at that point, or they might reach out directly from their own email to the author. Most of the comics I will edit, I think all of them. Ezra will edit most of the poetry, but there's a few exceptions, especially if like I've worked with someone before, but then I'll usually have Ezra read it because they're interested in kind of keeping that and shaping that section. And we work really well together. It has been amazing. I mean, honestly, like I said, it helps. Not being a profit-driven site probably has a lot to do with it. You know, it's literally a collective and it's driven by people's interest. And so people want to do the work, and we don't stress each other out.
That's a lot of work. So how many submissions do you get per month, would you say?
Oh my God, I have no idea. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, not good at quantifying these things.
Yeah. Would you say it's a lot?
It's not a lot. It's a reasonable amount. I mean, I think we're very specific. And I also don't answer a lot of the PR stuff that comes in. So if you're talking about, I mean, we get hundreds of things that are pitches from random PR for products or people tied to products that another site, like let's say, I don't know, I don't want to like Romper or something, right? They need to be responsive to that because it's part of their profit model, right? At least to have advertising, to have work that's very timely and tied to news stories or tied to product launches. And like, I just don't care at all about that. What I will tie our work to is book.
Oh, okay.
So a lot of our writers are working on books, are published authors in books. I come out of the book world. That's what interests me. So if I'm pitched a book, then we'll look for a way to excerpt it, to interview the writer. A lot of the work I write on the site is actually interviews. I also cover things like the Tribeca Film Festival. I'm very interested in film around parenting. So we'll cover documentaries. We did a listing ahead of the festival that's local. And we also, this is not your question, but we get a lot in, but a lot of it's not right for us. That's very easy to handle. So that's not our stuff.
So what are some common reasons for rejection? And I can assume, I think this is true across the board with all literary magazines, anything that's excessively violent or, overly like gory, graphic, hateful, anything like that. But just in terms of the craft, like where you sort of recognize, you read the first 2 paragraphs and you're like, I can already tell this isn't going to be right for us. What are there commonalities among pieces like that you see?
Yeah, what an interesting question, because of course we do have a lot that's violent and gory because we read about birth. And we published some very difficult, really difficult, gory stories. I mean, I just published a piece about uterine rupture. That was a very hard piece to read. That was one of the hardest pieces for me to read, actually. But I would say, I have a taste and a sense of taste. And I don't like anything that's like super chirpy, something that comes in and is maybe trying to sound really light and bouncy, like super bouncy, if that makes sense. There's a lot of kind of like, haha, I picked up my kid from school and she started talking about Taylor Swift. And then I was like, girls are crazy and boys are rough, just things that are really immediately parrot stereotypes are not for us. And you get that a lot. There's a lot of very easy, boring humor that you will be believed, and that's not for me, This is not the nicest way of putting any of this. Let me think again about how to
I like that.
We're a very inclusive space. We're designed to be inclusive, and we want the work to reflect that. And that sometimes means publishing people who maybe haven't done that work on themselves. But we are going to be thoughtful about how we publish their pieces, because I think that we get a lot of folks writing from like a very privileged white American experience. And we have space for some of that, but we're also really out there seeking diverse voices, folks who haven't been published in the mainstream parenting magazines. And so that's changed so much since the magazine first launched, that I think there's been a number of other spaces. You've been interviewing some of those editors in this particular series. And that's just wonderful. Like, I feel like we've been part of a period where there's been a huge explosion in platform options, exploding platform options. I would edit myself here if it's an essay. And that's great. And we want to continue publishing those folks. We've done partnerships, for example, with Raising Mothers, which is a site focused on writers of color who are writing about motherhood, and Modern Mia, which is a Black motherhood site. We've done exchanges with those sites where we've had work published by Black writers on our site that then has been reprinted there, and vice versa. Features of those editors. It's really more about what I'm trying to bring in than what I'm rejecting. But I think that like the very obvious pieces rejecting is if it's like just following a lot of stereotypes or super prescriptive. I'm not interested in a piece that comes in and says, this is a piece about how to lose 10 pounds after you have a baby. That's just not at all for us. And it's not going to be interesting. If it's a piece about grappling with body image and health, or like it's a story of someone who had gestational diabetes and they're navigating what that means in the healthcare system, or what that meant to their sense of self, like that would really interest me. But things that are very prescriptive are not right for the magazine.
Are you open to experimental forms of journalism? Like, so I'm thinking like a lot of times writers use the how-to form to relay a personal experience, right? Like how to grieve after a loss or something like that. So
we publish some of that, but that's really not, I think that's less what we publish actually. And I think that has risen, right? Because of search engine optimization, like people, like that is the title format that comes out of the internet shaping the way people search and then magazines trying to publish to that.
Right.
And again, because we're not profit driven, like that isn't how I structure the magazine. I structure it much more like a traditional literary magazine where I think about the work and the needs of the work and not the quickest way to search for it, or that we're going to like try and trick Google. I don't need to have a prescription at the end or a set of advice or guide.
Yeah.
We do publish work that gets at that. And then sometimes we do it in a very ironic way. So it'll be like, you know, how to not be the best mother, you know, something like that. We have work that maybe more deliberately counters or perverts that form.
Right. Yeah, that's what I meant, actually. I'm like work that is like a personal essay, but uses the how-to for, like how to like.
Yeah, we just did a piece about, that was like a cocktail recipe that was about grief.
Right.
So we're totally interested in that kind of work. I mean, we publish comics, right? Like I'm interested in all sorts of different hybrid works, you know, and that's something we've done a number of photo essays, work that has photographs and then pieces about it, like short, short prose poems following. Lisa Albert put a piece up like that quite early on, who wrote After Birth. It's a really fantastic writer.
Yeah, I know.
Yes, so we are fully a place you could send experimental work, you know, may not all land, but as long as it's based in a nonfiction work.
Right. It's not like how to keep your bottle fresh or whatever, like literal instructions, but like an emotional sort of guide.
Yeah, if there was a title, How to Keep Your Bottle Fresh, and then it was actually very different.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, that's a good title.
Yeah. So do you have any advice for writers? I asked this of Marjorie Tesser too, who edits Mom Egg Review, about for writers who, because you mentioned trying to avoid the overly cheerful, and how when writing about motherhood or children, it's very easy to be sentimental, I think. So do you have advice for writers, maybe sort of born out of things that you're seeing in the submissions queue, like how do you avoid sentimentality when you're writing about any of these issues, or how do you avoid just like overdoing it if you're writing about these very, very personal issues?
What a good question. And you know, it's funny, I mean, I should say the things everyone says, which is read the magazine. I think the magazine, we do have an unusual and distinct voice and brand, so to speak, right? And you'll get a sense of who we are. And it does come out of a different place than a lot of other contemporary online journals, and that we come more out of a zine culture and out of an indie publishing culture, which has a lot more rough around the edges aesthetic, right? So even the site itself has an aesthetic that's fairly low key.
Doorbell.
Ignore it for a minute. Again. So the answer to your question about sentimentality, I hesitate a little to say that we are erasing sentimentality, and I don't want it to sound like we're so fully punk rock that we're cynical either. I mean, we're very loving. Like, motherhood is a very loving and joyful experience, and we would avoid work, I think, that's treacly, but I definitely, that is part of the eye that we're looking for. That's part of leaning into it, is really leaning into the rapture and ecstasy of motherhood, and leaning into the reason that people become parents often, which is this like incredibly powerful falling in love and with a child, with who you are after the transformation of becoming a parent, with the partners and others in your community who raise kids with you. So I think actually, like, the honesty of the love story really interests me. But I think that editorially, something that I find a lot is that the sentimentality comes from a desire to come to a kind of pat conclusion, to try and tie things up with a bow.
Right.
And there's a feeling, I think, that I get from a lot of authors who know they're publishing about their kids, or that their own mom might read this, or maybe their mother-in-law, and that they want it to seem like everything's okay in the end. Like at the end of it, they're like, but you know, and I watched them walking off to school and I thought they're gonna grow up fine. And like, I was gonna strike that line for most cases, because unless they're just so much better actualized as a person than I am, I don't know that that's a real feeling that you get. Or if that's what the piece is about contentment, and that is something I'd lean into. But that drive to make everything all happy at the end, happily ever after, is something that I don't find compelling. And I think it actually is destabilizing for the kinds of readers who come to us looking for authenticity and community in what can be a very challenging period. Because I think a lot of really mothers who are and babas and other ways of defining their relationship as parents in an inclusive way come from a place of destabilization, where they've undertaken this and they're like in shock. So this sense of the mothers who are writing have figured it all out is not useful.
Yeah. Is that a common thing that you're doing when you work with writers and you're helping edit their work? Is that a common editorial suggestion that you find yourself making? Like, you don't need this line, this is too, you're tying it up too nicely, like the piece is great as it is, you don't need this little bow at the end.
Yeah, I mean, that's been across my career. Like, I think you need to have I like endings that open things up versus tie them up. I mean, there are pieces where the need is, hey, like we've been talking about, so we have a series on climate change someone started writing, and I'm like, it could be useful at the end to get some ideas. Like, it's not that we absolutely avoid anything prescriptive. We try to avoid that as the genre. Essentially, there's a real prescriptive genre in writing about motherhood, but we do want something real for people to hold on to. But in general, I would say that there's a kind of fear, I think, at the end of the piece. Like, a writer comes to the end and there's a feeling of like, we got to make this nice,
right?
That I would say that I push back on, where maybe a whole other paragraph to kind of break something up and like leave the reader thinking about something, rather than like the sort of cozy mystery sense of like, we finished the case.
Right. Especially with something like climate change, you don't want to end it with like, and everything's going to be okay.
Right. Or everything's going to be terrible, which is kind of what this is about. But
right.
But with a birth story, you do end it with a baby in your arms, and that's a beautiful story. So we'll usually end with, we use a lot of images too. So we might end on an image.
Yeah.
Image of a baby in an arm. People know what that means. It's not the end of the story.
Right. Oh, that's really nice.
Of it, like a different story.
Yeah. That just totally derailed my next question. Now I'm just thinking about the baby in the arms.
Right, it's beautiful, right? I don't think that there is a tendency of sentimentality and a kind of more conservative view of motherhood that we definitely is not a good fit with the magazine, that I would say that we avoid. And I'm not interested in that work. It just feels like it gives me hives a little bit.
Can you say more about that? What do you mean by conservative idea of motherhood?
Well, I mean, it's very reinforcing of patriarchal gender norms for women is not interesting to us in the magazine. So something that says like, that's just like how to get married and how to, we're coming right out of like Roe versus Wade threats here. And so like there's a very, very strong reinforcing of like a very traditionalist gender norm for mothers, and that's something that you will see work coming in that feels like real propaganda for that, and that's not
Do you receive sort of relatedly like political screeds, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, we do, and I think we publish the ones that make sense for us. But I get like a lot of like focus on the family PR, and I mostly just forward it to my friend with like a laughing. I actually have a joke about this, that I'm going to sometime all this PR that we get, I'm just going to do a piece. It's like the most hilarious PR I've ever received,
Oh, you should. I that would be really interesting. Like, so I guess people assume because you're a magazine dedicated to motherhood that you, I don't know, would be interested in all kinds of products.
PR. I just laugh so much. I mean, first of all, we just get these like completely insane pearl clutching, please join our book banning and burning campaign stuff that's just terrifying.
Yeah.
And then we also just get like, we have a Kickstarter to make bottles out of mason jars, and I'm just, it's hilarious. That actually sounds kind of cool. I remember that one. I was like, send me a mason jar bottle, please. But we just get a lot of stuff that's not for us. We're not doing PR.
Right. So how do you shape, do you work with writers to shape their sort of political, because I imagine like so much is happening all the time in the news, and very strong opinions, and they see that your magazine, is interested in the subject that they're writing about, and that it publishes nonfiction. And so you must get a lot of submissions where people are just like very raw kind of ranting. And will you work with those writers, or does it depend, or do you just reject them out of hand?
No, we definitely publish rants.
Okay.
I'll find them to send you. Yeah, we publish rants. I mean, I think it depends on how good a rant it is, you know.
Yeah.
And we've done a number of people's on pieces on mom rage. You know, actually, Mina Dubbin, who has a book now on mom rage. We did a number of her lists that were just like things she was upset about.
Yeah.
We did tons after the election of Trump, you know, major pieces we published. We were like a very strong, like radical left political leaning, I think. So though in that orientation, there's a lot of folks who are coming and publishing from different perspectives, and I will talk with them. I mean, editorially, the main thing is if somebody's really like tripping up, I think, or saying something that I think is going to strike people as racist or sexist, I'll try and bring that up to them, and then they can examine it and decide how they're going to edit the work. I mean, usually by the time they've submitted to the magazine, they have a pretty good sense of our vibe.
Sure.
But you know, I'm not going to publish a rant I don't agree with fundamentally. If there's something that, but that being said, I'm definitely publishing work all the time that may or may not align with my own parenting experiences. That doesn't mean it's not political, you know, just for example, like I breastfed my kids and I'm still nursing my toddler. And we published a number of people about people who just like completely did not work for them. And they were super annoyed by evangelicalism around breastfeeding. And they're just like, yay, formula, thank you, this saved my life. We published a number of those pieces. And I actually think those go hand in hand. Like that was something that is a very real issue, the pressure to breastfeed for a lot of people, opposed to the pressure of formula companies. And it may have been something that I had a really hard time with breastfeeding, actually. And I wrote a long piece about it on the site. And so I had a strong understanding of what that experience was like, to feel like you were failing.
Yeah.
And so people writing celebratory pieces about using formula was really important to me, to give them space to do that, even though that wasn't what we ended up doing. Right. So that's just an example of something that is actually huge, like hotbed topic, playground, but and gets at larger political issues like interventions in hospitals and the way that women have autonomy or not, you know, and the cost of breastfeeding in terms of time and how that interacts with people's ability to work independently, for example. So really any kind of parenting choice often is not a real choice. It's like a set of decisions that may feel very much out of your control. And they're all in a greater political structure and socioeconomic reality. So we try and reflect that by publishing different voices, but also respecting them. If that makes sense.
I think that makes sense, and that's really well said and really interesting, because I also remember when my my daughter's now 6, and when she was a baby, like the cry it out school versus the wait it out school, it was so contentious. And then you move past that phase. Like obviously now I don't even think about that anymore. And it's like when you're in it, I mean, all you can think about is sleep and which method and what does it mean if I do attachment versus detachment, and what does it mean if I, you know, like I try to put her in their own bed and let them cry it out. Like it's all so fraught. And then what's funny is that you sort of move past it and you never think about it. Like now I just totally forgot all about it until just this moment.
Right. So a lot of what's published is like the dogma around that. That's often what you'll see. And I do think we try and avoid that. So we might publish someone talking about like, my kid doesn't sleep and this is what it's been like to go through that, or like why I love doing the family bed and talking about it. But then we definitely try and avoid it being your child will suffer forever because you didn't do the family bed, you know, like that's just, there's enough of that out there, and I think it's very divisive. But there's room for really interesting individual stories that have these details of this reality around it, who approach it in a different way.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like you're trying to present the array of experiences without judgment, you know, like here's a person who is doing the, you know, here's a person who's nursing her 4-year-old, and this is her experience, and this is her story. We think it's an interesting story, you know, and here's a person who is bottle feeding, and, you know,
Yeah, or they're driven to write about it. You know, I think that's mostly what's most pertinent to them. And they're not out there trying to advise other parents necessarily.
Right.
They certainly will have work that I think gives parents inspiration and advice or a sense of, but they're not out there being prescriptive. Like we're not primarily looking to do that. Right.
That makes sense. Is there something you want to see more of in submissions? Like, I don't know, maybe from international writers, or I don't know, just something that you feel like you would want more of in the magazine?
I mean, I definitely would absolutely love to see more submissions from writers of color. We've published a lot of writers of color, but in some ways in a really positive way, because there've become more and more outlets actively seeking writers of color, then I think there's more and more places to publish. And so I'd love to have folks send them to us. And then I think the best way we can do that is to continue to publish writers of color. So if you see a writer of color on the main page, you're going to be more comfortable submitting where they send their work. We do a lot of comics. I love to get more comics. So if people are hearing this and they are interested in doing graphic narratives or pairing with someone who does a comic and then trying to tell their story that way, that's something I'd love to see even more of.
Anything you would like to see less of? I know editors, you don't want to be prescriptive and say don't send it, but are you just like, have you had enough of like pandemic stories, or you know, are you all set?
I mean, I've had enough of the pandemic, but I don't think that, you know, there's been a couple of times where I've said to someone, you know, we've really published a lot about the pandemic or this particular angle on it. Like we've done a lot of like pieces where somebody found out their kids had COVID and what they did, or that's come up.
Right.
And I think something I'm very uninterested in general is the beginning of that piece, sort of saying like, I've done such a perfect experience, but Joey's little friend's mom, like she took him outside not wearing a mask, and like this, and like I'm just very uninterested in that at this stage. But because that's like
just, that could be like a really funny satire piece, but anyway,
but people talking about like the uniquely difficult experience of dealing with children who have health issues through the pandemic is something we've that's something that we hold a lot of space and respect for. So I'm definitely not saying that, like we're in the pandemic still, so we're going to reflect on that. And we've done some really fantastic work early on. Actually, I was very surprised by how much great work we suddenly got in the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, it was just a terrible experience, and I didn't know whether the magazine could survive, because I do work also and my kids were around all the time. So I had a new baby. He was 1, and it was just a nightmare. And I think like everybody, we all had like, my mother was very privileged actually, but it was hard in being inside of it. And then we suddenly got all this amazing work. I mean, we started the series with Robin Jordan. There were drawn diaries, the comics diaries from the pandemic that ended up later being part of an installation at the Seattle Center in Seattle, Washington. And they were blown up. And then she had like a piece written about them. And I think they were just such a beautiful, it was just such a beautiful series. And I think that became so exciting and inspiring to me. So I do think it was a time when a lot of people were jolted and driven to write about what they were experiencing. Jade Sanchez Ventura, who's been an editor on and off actually at the magazine as well, but is currently a contributing writer. She has a regular column about home and our sense of home. She wrote a number of works for a while. There was an earlier column or series she had called Raising Babies in End of Days that had been started after the election of Trump and then rolled into the pandemic, about trying to navigate, you know, the sense of impending doom and what, like how she is a writer of color in New York and the thinking about her family and her family structure navigated that. So she wrote a piece about leaving Brooklyn and coming back during the pandemic that was really beautiful. And the right kind of work like that absolutely still has a place. There's very little I would say we need less of. I mean, something that's not a good fit is like a granddad who is not a mother sending me a piece that's sentimental. You know, that's not something I pick up because it's not the right fit. You know, I mean, like anyone, I need stuff that's just not up at all to be submitted, but it's not, that's just a misreading of our guidelines, I guess.
What about sort of reportage and editorial pieces? Is that your thing? Something that
we do have those, I would say more rarely, partly because it's a volunteer-run site. I mean, I think if someone's pitching a reported piece, often they're going to need funding and they're going to need a magazine that can support that. That being said, we get reported pieces. I actually think we end up often, and I'm completely fine with this, being a space where someone wrote a reported piece for another site and it didn't end up working. And sometimes because it was longer, or they got into details in a way that the site found too complex, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And we've received pieces from, like, some of the reported, I don't want to go back and unpick that, maybe they were for somewhere else first, because it gets into details and maybe the writers don't want to talk about, but we've definitely received a number of reported pieces where someone finished something and they were like, this is no longer a fit for XY magazine because it's too long, but would you consider it? And then I'm amazed, and sometimes it can be the best pieces published, right? And we'd run excerpts from books that are reported often, so that comes together. But some of the, like, we had a really long reported piece by Gina Frangella, which was really fantastic. Even those, though, we do look to have a personal story to be a part of it. For the most part, there can be exceptions.
Yeah. So usually, like, a few pieces I saw on the site today, like, it sort of starts with a personal experience and then it ties to something larger trends and maybe like a few statistics or details thrown in there, but it's mostly revolving around the writer's personal experience.
Right. I mean, we're a literary essay site, I think, at heart.
That's great.
But we definitely have reported pieces, and I think it's useful. Are you thinking of the piece Chanting? Was that what you were looking at?
No, it was about the autism poster.
Oh yeah, that's a great piece.
Yeah.
Right. So that's something that will definitely fit on the site. And I would say editorially, I would say we don't necessarily ask writers to do that. If someone brings a piece in, I'm not going to say this needs to get tied to larger trends or statistics. But if they're bringing a piece in that starts tying into larger trends and statistics, we'll look to see if we can back that up and bring in some reporting into it. And, as an editor, I'll bring my knowledge base to that. Or so would Cheryl or Ezra or Jennifer. They all have knowledge bases that they bring in.
This is a very cut and dry question, but what is your response time to pieces generally?
I usually say 4 to 6 weeks. It really varies. Sometimes it can be quite fast. We also take periods that you'll get an out of office. I think that's actually currently true because we were on spring break in New York City for schools. And so I wasn't able to respond to submissions or like my day job will get really busy. It varies. I actually don't know what's considered fast. We're definitely not as fast as a site with a lot of editors that has newsy pieces going up all the time, right? And sometimes we have a piece that will be accepted, but it might be 3 or 4 months out to publication, which is more commonly associated with a literary magazine or a poetry magazine. I would say that's not uncommon. Usually I'm running from acceptance to about a month and a half out. To publish, but it depends.
Yeah. And how are there ways for people to get more involved in the magazine as readers or volunteers, guest editors?
Well, readers, we have a newsletter. So if people sign up and follow the magazine on social media and sign up to get the newsletter, that would be great. The newsletter is very basic. It's essentially, I call it like Mother in your inbox. It's what we publish recently. And if you start writing for the magazine and you express that you'd be interested to do more, I will probably start trying to tap you to do book coverage because we get pitched many more books to cover than I can cover. So I'll ask folks to consider an interview with a writer. And then that's a great way to actually, I think, develop that skill. And then that's something you could pitch to other larger platforms, in the future, because you'll have more clippings that include Q&As with writers, which is kind of a great skill, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say, I'm not just like I'm a fairly maternal editor. I always describe myself that way, but I want the writers who publish us to have a sense that we're a place that will help support their career. So like if their book ultimately comes out, that we're going to be the place again that they can excerpt when the book comes out, or that we're going to help support them. There's been a number of pieces that published in the magazine that became the seed for book proposals and became books, and some of them have published recently, like Motherhood So White by Nefertiti Austin was originally a piece in the magazine called Adoption So White. There's a book called The Story Is Not About Benedict Cumberbatch. I'm sorry, I have to remember the writer's name. I know her to look it up, but you should look up the piece on the site's hilarious. That was about her as a young mother becoming like obsessed with fan fiction around Benedict Cumberbatch. And that was about like rediscovering her sexuality and her joy. And then she's written a whole book about that that's got some nice buzz around it. And so that is very exciting to me to think about being a place that helps people start developing ideas or get some pieces out there that end up catching on or catching attention, and then maybe catch the attention of an agent and become a book. And it's not guaranteed, but it's the advice I give writers in general, is to publish their work, get it out there. And like, that's how you start developing a platform, is by not holding back and writing a whole manuscript necessarily, but beginning to publish your work. And then you get the attention of the publishing industry at large, rather than necessarily always knocking at the door. So the ways to get involved, we are starting to do events again. So coming to our events, helping to publicize our events is a great thing. We had a reading and conversation at AWP that Cheryl Klein and Erin Pushman, who was one of our writers, put together. I'm hoping to maybe do something around the Brooklyn Book Festival this fall. We'll see, fingers crossed. I used to work with them quite a long time, so we might end up doing a live event. Otherwise, it's really just reading and sharing. That's really the best way to become involved in submitting your work if you've got something.
Great. We have a question here. If I haven't had an essay published with you yet, could I do an interview with an author? I'd love to work with writers when their books are coming out.
Definitely, you could pitch an interview with a writer if you have a writer in mind or a book coming out that you'd want to consider. You could always write me about it. Definitely the best ways. Usually I'm more likely to offer that to someone we've published in the past, but I've had people come in with pitches of Q&As with a writer for the first piece, and that's been something we've occasionally published. So yeah. It's better if you come pitching with, here's a writer I want to talk to, but really I'm very open to inquiries in general. Like we're here to, we may not get back to people right away. It might take a couple of weeks, but I'm very open to hearing from writers and what they want to do with the site.
And do you publish book reviews?
We used to do roundups, and we still will sometimes do that. I would not say on the regular that we publish book reviews. We're just not set up for that. But we have, for example, we used to do this thing called Ask a Mother, which I just haven't gotten around to it because of the pandemic, really. Like, it's a little bit more editorially heavy of a lift, where we write to a number of our contributors and say, like, tell me the best book you read last year, or like, what's the book coming into fall that you would give another parent? And that is more the form the book reviews take. But we have had somebody do like an essay that brings together 2 or 3 books. And we just, like Milda DeVoe, who runs Pen Parentis here in New York, she just did more of like an encounter piece with the book. So we got a book, and instead of doing a Q&A, it was a book about immigrant families, and she was an immigrant herself and hadn't raised her kids. She's Lithuanian. And she wrote more of like a response essay to the book than a book review per se. So I am interested in that. And we've had a number of pieces that have done that.
Yeah. It just totally out of the blue reminded me. I read Lydia Yeknovich's The Chronology of Water right after having my child, and it was an amazing book. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to read it.
I haven't read it, but I know her work.
Yeah.
I definitely think the experience of becoming a parent, however you get there, is one that opens you in a new way to different kinds of literature and film.
Yeah.
And it's something that starts guiding your encounters to it. And that's something that I'm very interested in the site, is how people read things as parents. Or we also have a lot of people writing about trying to become parents, so they may not be parents yet.
Oh, interesting.
We also have people writing about being child-free or child, who either from that perspective, like that is who we are, and I want to share that on the site with other parents so they can understand more about that, or maybe more commonly, unfortunately, someone who's tried in various ways to create a family and it has not happened for them, and then reckoning with that and coming to that decision.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today and coming out and talking about the magazine. Everybody should go check it out. It's Mutha.
Like I said, we're just out there publishing stories about parenting.
Yeah.
From every angle. That's what our is.
Yeah, I love it. It's great. So, and you guys are on Twitter is it at Mutha?
At Mutha Magazine. I'm at Meg Lemke. In fact, our main editorial group is, if you go to the Mutha Magazine Twitter, you can follow our editors. Ezra doesn't have Twitter, but they're findable.
Yeah.
They're really amazing poet and writer, and someone to follow for sure.
Who is this?
Ezra Stone, our poetry editor.
Oh, okay, great.
they use they, them as the pronoun.
Okay, super. Well, thank you again. This is really, it's just a great magazine, very, very useful for parents who are seeking comfort, company, humor, all that stuff when you're a new parent. So go check it out, Mother Magazine, find them on Twitter. And thank you so much, Meg.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, everyone.